You are listening to Parliament Matters, a Hansard Society production supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Learn more at hansardsociety.org.uk/pm.
Hello and welcome to Parliament Matters, the podcast from the Hansard Society about the institution at the heart of our democracy, Parliament itself. I'm Ruth Fox.
And I'm Mark Darcy. Every week we're going to be analysing what's going on behind the Gothic facade of Westminster.
Helping you to stay on top of the key parliamentary issues of the week and what lies ahead.
And we'll be explaining how the system works.
And hearing about the latest research and innovations in Parliament and politics from influential thinkers and practitioners.
Providing new perspectives from inside and outside of Westminster.
And we'll be travelling back in time to some of the pivotal moments in parliamentary history.
To help you understand exactly how we've arrived where we are today. Coming up.
So the government survived the second reading vote on the Rwanda Bill, but are they out of the woods yet, and what's going to happen next?
Certainly more trouble to come, one suspects, and we'll be talking to one of the sharpest observers of what goes on the floor of the House of Commons about what's happening now, what the mood of MPs is, and how the whole issue is going to play in the longer term.
Before we get there, Mark, I just want to say a few words to thank everyone for listening to the podcast and sending us some really kind messages, particularly our growing legion of international listeners, particularly those of you in Canada, you know who you are. If you're enjoying the podcast, remember to rate it wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps others find out about us. And if you've got any questions, send them to us and we'll answer them over one of our urgent question episodes or one of our bonus episodes. Send them to hansarsociety.org.uk/PMUQ. And as we're approaching the Christmas season, we've got some special bonus episodes for you, so you don't miss out on your parliamentary fix over the festive season. So make sure you're subscribed, make sure you're following us on social media at Hansard Society to get them in your podcast feed as soon as they are published.
Well, in the end, was it high drama or a bit of a damp squib? This was the week when Rishi Sunak's fate was supposedly in the balance as MPs on his own side decided whether or not they were going to back his Rwanda Bill. The thought was that if the Prime Minister lost the second reading vote in the Commons and the bill didn't go forward even from its first debate, there'd be trouble. As it turned out, he won and won quite handily. And with us in the studio now is Rob Hutton, parliamentary sketchwriter of the Critic Magazine, who's been watching and documenting the proceedings as they unfolded. So, Rob, what's your verdict? High drama, damp squib?
More damp squib than high drama, I'm afraid. I mean, I think I was expecting it to be squibby because most of these do not, in fact, live up to billing. In the Brexit years, the thing was the majority was tiny, so you did only ever need a small number of MPs to rebel, to put whatever the government wanted to do in jeopardy. Now, even though we're having this sort of slow erosion of Tory MPs who are resigning and being recalled sort of at the rate of about one a month these days, and if we go on long enough, there goes the government's majority. But there is still a comfortable majority, so you need to be organised, really organised, to get a rebellion. And actually, this is a nerd's point, but the guy who was doing the organising in all the Brexit years was Steve Baker, and he was a really effective whip, for want of a better word.
Absolutely. Yeah. They called him Rebel Commander, didn't they?
Yeah, and he had a little black book, and he knew what everyone wanted, and he did all of the bits of it, because some of whipping is a pastoral role. It's about looking after people and understanding, Mark, that you don't really want to do this one, and well, okay, I put my arm around you and say, well, come on through for us anyway, or maybe you want to sit this one out, and I'll, because I know my numbers, I know I can afford to lose you, and I know my numbers, and I know the other guy's numbers, and Steve was really good at that.
And they've never quite replaced him since he's
now a government minister.
Yes. So then there needed to be someone else in the Brexiteer ranks who could kind of herd the cats in the same general direction, and there isn't someone who can do that apparently.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things that are sort of astonishing about politics when you explain them and you think this can't quite be true. But one of the things that is true is there are 650 members of Parliament, of whom 640-something actually turn up, of whom 630-something vote. Correct me on my numbers if I'm wrong.
This is minus the Sinn Féin MPs.
Yeah, minus the Sinn Féin MPs, speakers and deputies.
Take off 11, I think.
Yeah. That's actually a relatively easy number of people to keep track of. you know all their names and you know where all of them work. And yet actually keeping track of them is something that both official whips and unofficial whips find surprisingly hard to do. I mean, going back to the Brexit years, there was this argument, we kept seeing this story, and it was briefed to me at one point, that there were 30 Labour MPs who were ready to vote with the government to get a Brexit deal through. And I remember I started saying to government ministers and Tory MPs, well, who are they?
Name 3.
Yeah, well, then you could name 3, name 5. And then I got interested and I started totting them up. And I said, well, I think I can get you to 12. And I ran that story, and I ran basically saying there are not 30, but I think there might be 12. And I got a phone call from someone in government saying, who? And I said, really?
Not entirely encouraging.
Really? And that was the moment at which I thought, this is not going through. You guys can't do this, because the work of an afternoon to phone them all and ask them, and you could phone every Labour MP and say, would you vote with us? And ask them. It's not that hard. But in the same way, the rebels just they're not organised.
But isn't this partly, though, a reflection on your professions, if I may say, for both of you? Because when you talk about high drama, I mean, the drama's built up not just by the politicians, but by the media. Frankly, how many of your colleagues are, frankly, just a bit gullible and believe what some of these MPs tell them?
Or consciously flamming it up.
Yes, I would never accuse any of my colleagues of being gullible.
No,
my goodness, the very idea. But there are very few incentives in journalism ever, especially on a Sunday afternoon shift when there isn't much happening, to go to the editor and say, I don't really think we've got much of a story, I think this is going to be fine. All of the incentives are to flamming up, and you've got lots of people who are in this who are good at drama, and in the sense of, they're good at giving brilliant briefing quotes about bottles of whiskey and revolvers and paracetamol and all sorts of this, and
families and mafia and
where people are going to be stabbed and and emergency breakfast, and so there's lots of material. And when somebody says to you, well, could Sunak lose? And you say, well, certainly Sunak could lose. He could. There were, I don't think we've quite got to the bottom of how many of the 60 people who didn't vote were abstentions, as opposed to other sorts of, as it were, deliberate abstentions, as opposed to people who were absent. But let's say 40 of them were deliberate abstentions, which doesn't seem to me implausible, because there are people who are angry about this. Had they all voted against, it's feasible. So I think it was natural that it would end up getting built up. I mean, before I was a sketchwriter, I worked for Bloomberg, and actually a big part of my job was explaining to my readers that they didn't necessarily need to believe everything that they had read in the British. You don't. The government is not going to fall this week. You should not buy or sell a pound on the basis that is going to happen. And increasingly, actually, in a clickbaity world of news in which we live, there is very little percentage in having the fourth most exciting story about something on the internet. You want to have the most exciting stories.
So we're talking about the overestimation, if you like, of the power of the conservative right, the 5 families, as they were rather dramatically being described at one point. What about the other side of the equation? Because there were 2 strands to the story. One was that the hardliners wanted the bill drastically toughened up. And the other strand of it was that there were One Nation Tories out there who thought they'd gone just about as far as they could be dragged on the issue of abandoning the European Convention on Human Rights. And if they were dragged any further, these One Nation Tories might get antsy themselves and maybe not vote for the bill. If the hardliners were a paper tiger, were the One Nation side a paper tiger as well?
Yes, so first of all, it is an underestimated achievement of Rishi Sunak. He's managed to not just split the Conservative Party once, but twice, while uniting the opposition. I mean, this is a real wedge issue. Well done. I watched Bob Neal's speech. Bob Neal is very
chair
much
of the Justice Committee, former Justice Minister.
He's a serious lawyer, a kindly, thoughtful man, and he was explaining why he would vote for this, but he wouldn't vote for anything any further. And I'm afraid, forgive me, Bob, I thought I wouldn't want to be in a foxhole with anyone from the One Nation group. If you were in a foxhole with someone from the Tory right, but Mark Francois, he'd be shooting. I mean, he might be shooting in the wrong direction, but he would at least be shooting. I would, having watched the One Nation group fall in behind Boris Johnson in 2019, none of these guys they are always going to be saying, well, okay, you can have this thing, you can have this, but one more thing, and that's it. They are the least impressive. threatening people. I mean, one day maybe it will happen.
There was a marvellous sketch by the late Robin Williams about the British police being unarmed. He's saying, what do? They say, stop, or I shall shout, stop again. And
That's it, yes. But on the other hand, the one thing that the One Nation group have got that the Five Families, or whatever you want to call them, have not got is that if they all voted against something, they can stop it because they will be voting with the opposition. So are there 30 of them? Are there 30 of them who are willing to rebel? I'm sceptical. Yeah. But if they did, they will be voting with Labour and with the SNP and with the Liberal Democrats and apparently possibly with the DUP. And at that point, they can kill anything. So although I don't personally ever believe that I will see it, if I did see it, it would work. Whereas the problem that the Five Families have got as they go into committee stage, you're going to stop.
I know. I was just going to say, to explain for our listeners what the Five Families are.
Right.
Using this terminology, and I'm conscious we've got
sorry.
We're conscious we've got some listeners, not least outside the UK. So we've talked about the European Research Group.
Yep.
Steve Baker used to head. So that's one of them. So basically, the Conservative Party has got all these sort of factional groups, an alphabet soup of them. And the five we're talking about on this issue in relation to Rwanda, you've got the New Conservatives, which are sort of headed up by Miriam Cates and Danny Kruger. You've got the Common Sense group, headed up by Sir John Hayes, which is sort of fighting the culture wars and the sort of anti-woke issues. You've got the Northern Research Group, I think, with John Stevenson.
Are you going to ask me to name the rest of the five facts? I wouldn't have agreed to come on if I'd known that it was going to be that kind
Which one have I left out? No. And then you've got the Conservative Growth Group, headed up by Ranald Jayawardena. I think that's the five.
Yeah, but there's an alphabet soup, but they also interlock a lot, and some people can be in several of these groups. So there's a kind of constellation of groupsicles around the edge of the Conservative Party, also tugging at its hem in different ways.
They said that they'd met together in this sort of, they'd looked at the bill in a star chamber, they'd met together and they'd agreed collaboratively that they were going to take a common position. And they clearly didn't.
I suppose their common position was that they were going to abstain,
well, some
very
of them
grumpily.
Didn't. Some of them voted for the bill.
Oh, right, yes, so, right.
Yeah.
So not even... I watched, because actually we had a very early filing day that day, so I had to have my copy away by 5 o'clock, and I watched the first 2 hours of this, and I thought, this bill is fine. You do get a sense when people are fixing to vote again. And, at the point at which I was sending my copy off, no one had yet, and indeed, obviously no one did stand up and say, I shall vote against.
One of the mysteries, though, of the Rwanda debate was this whole question of pairing. Now, the normal business of MPs sort of pairing up with someone who's going to vote in the opposite direction so that they can both be absent from the chamber is just a routine part of parliamentary life. But on a debate this big, it's something that's a bit less usual. I mean, there were one or two people who clearly were paired. Lisa Nandy had, I think, just had surgery or something, the Labour shadow minister, and she said on Twitter that she was paired with someone. But you also had Graham Stewart, the climate change minister, come scuttling back from COP, the meeting in the Gulf that he was attending there, the climate conference. And that attracted quite a lot of attention because that suggested the alarm bells were really clanging in the Whip's office, that they were getting a minister some 3,000 miles away to rush back to cast a vote.
Yes, and I mean, actually, there was one moment of drama during the debate, quite early on, was when we saw Peter Bone wander back in, who has basically not been seen since he was found against by Standards Committee. Somebody had obviously phoned him up and said, get yourself back here.
Well, his sanction had expired, hadn't it?
Yes.
So he was able to come back, but he's still subject to his recall petition.
He is, and generally he's been keeping a low profile.
Yeah.
And so his presence was taken slightly as a sign that the government was worried. I mean, the basic way that pairing works is that there is a government whip's office and an opposition whip's office, and an MP who, for whatever reason, doesn't want to or can't get to the vote, goes to their whip and says, please, can I have a slip? It's called, can I be slipped? A slip of paper, I think. And the whips will say, well, we will see what we can do, and they obviously have an order of priority. Now,
they find someone else to stand out.
Yeah, so they then go across the lobby to the other whip's office, and they say, we've got 3 people who can't make it. Do you have 3 people who can't make it? And we will offset them against each other. This is what's called the usual channels, and it's a way that Parliament works. Sometimes it breaks down. During the Brexit years, again, Jo Swinson, a Liberal Democrat, was on maternity leave, and this is my story actually. She tweeted, "I am not voting," and she said who she was paired with, and I'd just seen him vote. And so I phoned her up and I said, I don't think you are paired. And she said, well, I am. And there was a
row in the chamber.
There was a big row about it because essentially this is cheating. This is not against
the code of honour that you're supposed to operate by.
Yes. And Alistair Carmichael, who was the Lib Dem whip, was absolutely furious about this. But also, Andrea Leadsom, I think, was she Leader of the House at the time? But Andrea Leadsom, who's very big on maternity rights and early years care, she was, from the government side, absolutely livid that the government had done this to a woman who was on maternity leave, in Scotland. I mean, it's not easy for Jo Swinson to sort of just pop down. So it can go wrong. And actually, I think the result of that is that since then they have been a bit more careful about it, because if it breaks down, the danger is that everyone... It's in the great play This House, when they say, right, pairing's off.
And havoc ensues.
Yes. So I'm not surprised in a sense that Lisa Nandy was paired, because if you're a whip, your priority would be people who are in hospital.
But you'd also thought that a similar deal might apply to a government minister representing Britain at a really important international conference. Was Graham Stewart's summons back a bit of performance art?
Well, I wonder if it was. I mean, I don't know who else the government had on its list. I mean, it may be that they had somebody else who was in hospital as well.
They brought select committees back. I mean, the International Development Committee was due to be in the Caribbean. I think the Foreign Affairs
Reached the time of year for it.
It was either the International Development Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee, but they both had to cancel trips. And again, you'd have thought that whilst maybe not everybody could have been paired, there could have been some pairing on.
Well, no, because obviously those committees have got people on both sides.
Yeah. So again, it comes back to the theatre. Was he building up this idea that this is much closer than it actually was?
A bit of expectations management.
Yes. I wonder also, I mean, again, how good is the government whipping operation at the moment?
Yeah.
You hear different things, and I don't particularly have a view on the current lot, but actually, if ideally, the government whip knows on the morning of the vote what the vote is going to be. If they have done their job properly, that's how it works. Because you just ought to know, really, by then. Very few people have their mind changed.
Are we seeing the whips pretending to be all-seeing, and this is us being terribly cunning and generating a sense of crisis just to dramatise events when actually we knew it was going to be all right? Or is that what they're pretending what happened and they had no idea?
I think there's also a thing that if somebody's in the Middle East, it's a bit get them back, because if we realise we need to get them back at 2:00, that's going to be too late.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a vote that Gordon Brown I can't remember what it was. It must have been ID cards or something in 2005. Gordon Brown literally landed in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and
took off again.
Yeah, exactly. That was at that one point his one trip to the Middle East. I don't think he actually got off the runway. Because they needed him back, because it's one thing to say, you can nip out for dinner, but be ready to come back if I need you. It's another thing if you're
several thousand miles away.
Yeah, then so it may be they didn't want to take that risk.
We should explain for listeners, this is private deal essentially between the whips. This is not something that's formally recorded by the House of Commons officials and doesn't enter the record. So it's not part of the voting records of the House. We know that they were not present to vote, but we don't know that it was because they were paired. No,
we don't. And you have to ring people up and ask them. There are a whole load of procedures in the House that are not written down, but that are well managed. And a lot of them have to do with the whip's office.
But these are essentially political arrangements as opposed to formal parliamentary arrangements.
Yes, yeah.
So half the fun of going through a list of who's voted which way at the end of a sort of contentious vote like that one is trying to figure out, when the people weren't there, whether they were not there because they'd arranged to be away, or whether this was a sort of political process and they weren't supporting their own side.
I mean, sometimes MPs enjoy a bit of constructive ambiguity about that. The sort of the version of John Major's toothache. Well, I wanted to be there, but sadly I was unable. And I mean, sometimes, I'm sure, as with Lisa Nandy, she wants people to know. And actually, it's easier now, because there's social media and because there's all this pressure on MPs. I think 20 years ago, the Shadow, would not have bothered to explain their absence. But Lisa Nandy wants her voters to know, look, I would have been there, but I'm in hospital. I have a good excuse. Other people sometimes are quite happy for no one to quite know. There's also the business of what's called a conscious abstention. And I think there was one in this one, where an MP will vote on both sides.
Walk through both lobbies, yeah.
So actually they'll appear in both lists. And that's their way of saying, I pitched up and I did my job and I am very deliberately abstaining, and I'm abstaining at work as opposed to sloping off for a drink.
And what do you think was the irritation levels generated by all this?
Among MPs, you mean?
Yeah. Particularly Conservative ones.
The trouble is that they've sort of become obsessed with Rwanda as a solution, and I don't see why it is. I genuinely just to think, if people are willing to cross the world's busiest sea lane to get here, the prospect that they have a very small chance of being put on a plane to Rwanda one day is not that much of a deterrent. But Conservative MPs have sort of convinced themselves that literally, if this passes, so the small boats problem stops. I mean, the oddest thing about this is that in the last couple of weeks we've learned that, even if you did get small boats to zero, if you think that immigration is a major issue, you've got hundreds of thousands of people who are coming to Britain completely legally, and that is government policy. And all these people are coming with visas that the Home Office has given them. If you think that's a problem, you sort of need to go and have a word with the Home Office.
And we're now told that what happens next is that they're waiting to see how the bill is amended when it comes up. There are going to be 2 days of Committee of the Whole House on this in the new year at some point, 6-hour slugs twice. And that's the moment they say they want the government to change the bill. What we know now is that on that showing, they don't have the numbers to force an amendment, even if they could find something on which they could vote with the opposition, and that seems extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
So at this stage, it's basically if Rishi Sunak wants to keep these guys happy, he can make amendments. But actually, on this showing, couldn't he just ignore them?
Well, yes. I mean, so I was then later talking to a Tory MP who said, well, yes, this was their moment of maximum strength and they did nothing. So their threat is that when the bill comes back for third reading, after the committee stage, which is the next point at which, as it were, they vote on the whole thing, they could vote against it at that point. And at that point, Labour will be voting, all the opposition parties will be voting against it. So if they were to vote with Labour, they could kill it. And Labour, as it were, would be trying to kill it because they think it's a terrible idea. Yeah. And they will be trying to kill it. The five families will be trying to kill it because they think it doesn't go far enough. Yeah. Are they going to get 30 of them to do it?
It's a very big ask, isn't it?
Yeah, and what then? Because you're killing your Rwanda bill so that you can have nothing, And actually, I mean, one of the interesting moments in the debate where I slightly hesitate to attribute this to Edward Lee, I'm pretty sure, said something along the lines of, well, I'm not really sure that this would work. We've got to do something, and this is something, so we'll do it. Not using those words, but that was, and you sort of thought, this is desperate, guys. That does not sound to me like somebody who's going to say, we've got to do something, this something isn't good enough, so we'll do nothing.
So what you've then got is the prospect that the bill gets through in the form the government likes it. It gets sent to the House of Lords, where all the sort of small L liberal super lawyers in the House of Lords fall upon it and rewrite it in ways the government doesn't like, make sure that there are lots of human rights protections, and they take very big issue with the idea that the government can by law declare Rwanda to be safe. I think was it Edward Garnier, the former Solicitor General, was saying this is equivalent to legislating to declare all dogs to be cats or vice versa. So you could see the bill bouncing back from the House of Lords in a few months' time, but maybe the government wants that. Maybe the government actually wants a whacking great row about migration policy.
Or they want a whacking great row about the House of Lords.
A whacking great row about the House of Lords that they can
well.
possibly take to the country in a general election.
That's the operating theory, is that the only possible argument for this is that they want to have a fight. I mean, if I had to put money on it, I still don't expect a flight to Rwanda to take off. Certainly not one containing any asylum seekers.
Might be one containing a Home Secretary.
Yeah, we might get a new Home Secretary, and they too will have to go to Rwanda and hand over 50 million quid for something or for nothing.
But even just going to there's the bill, but there's also the treaty, and the treaty has provisions in it for bodies, monitoring bodies and so on, to be set up, to be established, that are supposed to look at, what happens once we start sending people across. That's going to take time. So the timetable just doesn't quite add up.
And if you're the Rwandan government, you can see what's happening here as well as anyone else. I mean, it's not so much that you'll be dragging your feet, it's just...
We've got the
money. This is the problem that's probably going to go away in a year. Why don't we just get on with other things? Yes, I don't see how it gets through the Lords, because they can't use the Parliament Act, because...
there isn't time.
Because there isn't time. Because they can't say this was in the manifesto, because it wasn't in the manifesto. And because it's also something that the House of Lords cares about.
Yeah.
So this is the worst kind of thing to take to the House of Lords, is anything to do with human rights. You think of basically all the big rows with the Lords have been Home Secretaries trying to do something, and all of the people look in the House of Lords, bishops, lawyers, former judges. These are people that you do not want to try and smuggle human rights stuff past. And they can all see it, and also they can see that there isn't a huge amount of enthusiasm for this in the Commons, and they too have a sense of the way in which the wind is blowing, and if we just take our time on this, lads, this one goes away.
So where does this leave the Conservative Party in the House of Commons. I mean, you think back to 2019, they were all conquering. They'd won Labour heartland seats. The opposition was nowhere. There must be this enormous sense that, frankly, they've blown it.
I think that's undeniable. And there was all of this stuff that Boris Johnson was elected promising to do, which if he had done it, let's imagine that levelling up, whatever it turned out to be, had been delivered over the last 4 years. Labour might be sitting in places like Teesside and sitting there thinking, well, I don't understand how we get this place back. But if I were a Labour candidate in any of those red wall seats, which are held by small majorities generally, I'd just be going around saying they were taking a mick. Look, they promised you all this stuff. Where is it? Where are your bigger roads? Where's your new leisure centre? Where's your library? Can you see a doctor? Did things get better?
Well, it's the traditional election campaign, isn't it? Are you better off today than you were in 2019, 2010?
Words that both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are using on a regular basis in every chance they get.
Core campaigning technique.
Yes. That was the Commons' adventures over Rwanda. But before that, you were looking at what Rishi Sunak had to say in the COVID inquiry, and before him, what Boris Johnson had to say in the COVID inquiry. Now, that's all been taking place kind of off stage from Parliament, but it's going to feed into Parliament eventually. What do you think is going to happen there?
So in terms of how MPs feel, none of that, I think, is making MPs feel better. I mean, Rishi Sunak definitely did better at the COVID inquiry than Boris Johnson did, in the sense that Boris Johnson was doing all of the things that Boris Johnson does. He was contradicting himself. He was saying things that seem implausible. The problem with what Rishi Sunak was doing at the COVID inquiry was there was an awful lot of I don't recalls. And in fact, there are various sort of compilation videos now doing the rounds on the internet of things he can't remember. Look, if I were a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, if I were a lawyer advising you before the COVID inquiry, I would just say, look, just you can't recall, you don't recall. Nobody can prove that you can remember something.
You penned an absolutely savage sketch which opened with the phrase IQ of 145 and can't remember.
Yes, that's a joke that only people over 50 will get, sadly. Yeah, it's a good tactic for avoiding indictment, if you see what I mean, but it's not a good political tactic. In the best defence, in a sense, that government ministers have got at the COVID inquiry is we were swept along by events, and we were doing what the scientists told us, and the science kept changing, and we were just trying to keep up, which I think has the virtue that is in large part true, certainly in the early days. And actually, I think that you can go a long way with the public when you talk to people about this. People understand that, in March 2020,
it was tough.
No one would have wanted to be making those decisions. Shall we close this? Shall we close it? It was a completely mad time. Maybe it took you a week longer. I know that the COVID families for justice will feel differently, but I think you could make a pretty good case out in the country saying, yeah, we spent a week longer than maybe we should have, trying to decide whether we were going to shutter every business and close every school, and that was a big decision. The problem is you get two things. You get the chaos that sort of follows that, and the feeling. It was just a feeling from about sort of the summer of 2020 that the government was all over the shop. And everything we're learning from the COVID inquiry is that, yes, the government was all over the shop. And actually, although all of these WhatsApp messages and everything are all absolutely fascinating, what's really interesting to me in my job now, where I'm not constantly trying to sort of get a behind-the-scenes look. My job is to sit there and look at what is on the record happening in public and write about it and, and make jokes about it, frankly, is the extent to which, all of my sketches from that point stand up, because the way that you could tell the government was in chaos was because every week they said a different thing. And one day Boris Johnson would be saying, of course I won't do that, and the next day he'd be doing it. It was on the record, as it were, the chaos.
And so are there great sweeping lessons to be learned about how future pandemics should be handled? Or is it basically, if you had a different Prime Minister, it would probably have been rather more orderly?
I'm sure that it's very hard to imagine that it would have been less orderly with a different Prime Minister. The problem we got with the COVID inquiry is that it's holding public hearings. It's also taking hundreds and thousands of pages of evidence that's just written evidence that Baroness Hallett is sitting there and reading. And people think that the inquiry is the public evidence. Actually, the inquiry is lots of other things. The inquiry is happening in a series of phases. So a lot of this stuff that we're reading, why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing that? Well, look, they're doing education. They're doing that in a future phase.
Yeah. It's
right
not all
now,
happening at once.
We're in the government decision-making phase. There's a lot about government decision-making.
Turn on, tune in, drop out. Rob Hutton, thanks very much for joining us on the pod.
Pleasure.
Well, there's a certain element of, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? But Ruth, what else caught your eye in this week's parliamentary events?
Well, we had the last PMQs of the year, but it was a pretty dull session. I don't think there's much to say about it because Rishi Sunak survived the COVID inquiry intact, and there wasn't really much significant news that came out about it. He didn't recall a lot, and that was reflected in PMQs.
Yeah, I think Keir Starmer had a certain amount of fun, but I don't think there was anything terminally wounding in the exchanges there, and it was just the PMQs usual, I think.
Yeah. The other thing that did catch my eye was another appearance by Kemi Badenoch before the Women and Equalities Committee, where there was a bit of a standoff between her and some of the committee members over poor questioning. It was a pretty bad-tempered discussion. Kemi Badenoch is pretty terrier-like. She doesn't let go when she's got a bit between her teeth. And there's a dispute about the use of the word epidemic in relation to a discussion about the rise in the number of young people who are part of the trans community. This was taken as an insult by a Labour MP. And there was a sort of, quite a lot of back and forth about, accusations of lying, unparliamentary language. I think you should withdraw that statement. It all got a bit heated and messy.
It used to be said of Ken Clarke that he'd cross the street to have a fight. And I think Kemi Badenoch is very much in that tradition of sort of pugilistic conservatism. And she's not going to back down in front of that committee. And she's quite enjoying, I think, having some of those fights, because I'm sure they win her a lot of credit where she needs to win credit.
Yeah, she's, there were a lot of Conservative MPs who were applauding her for her stance. So that was one event on the committee corridor. Another that took my eye was the pre-appointment hearing for the new chair of the BBC, Samir Shah, who was up in front of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. Now, pre-appointment hearings were introduced in 2007, and basically select committees take evidence from a minister's preferred candidate for particular key appointments. They take place before the appointment is confirmed, but after the actual selection has taken place. So it's only one sort of nominee. It's not as if the committee's got a choice.
And they're not confirmation hearings in the sense that the person doesn't not get the job if the committee doesn't like them.
No.
The committee can find out what they think about stuff, but it can't say, no, you shouldn't appoint that person. They can recommend against it, but they can't block it.
Yeah, recent years, the same committee, Culture, Media and Sport, I think, said that the government's nominee to chair the Charity Commission was what they described as an archetypal and unimaginative choice, and the committee didn't feel able to approve his appointment, so they withheld their approval. Similarly, Michael Grade, of course, well-known broadcaster and
former chairman of the BBC. Indeed.
Yeah, indeed, media figure. He was lined up to be chairman of Ofcom, and the committee thought that he lacked depth when talking about social media and online safety. And again, they didn't feel able to support his appointment.
But did it go ahead anyway?
It went ahead anyway. Yeah. And this is the thing. So sometimes, the committee, if they criticise appointments, sometimes the candidate themselves will withdraw. Dame Janet Finch withdrew some years ago as she was recommended to be chair of the, I think it was Office for National Statistics. And sometimes, it can be a fairly excoriating report from the committee and the government just presses ahead, which of course famously one of the very early ones that happened was Ed Balls when he pressed ahead with, I think it was the Children's Commissioner at the sort of dying stages of the Gordon Brown government.
Yeah, much to the angst of the Select Committee chair at the time, Barry Sjem, and the Labour veteran who's standing down at the next election. But that was an example, really, of the kind of almost ritual nature sometimes of these hearings. There may be a bit of fun to be had questioning the person, but it has to be a pretty catastrophic implosion for them not to be appointed after the hearing.
Yeah, and this was an interesting one, of course, because it raised the question about Gary Lineker's, the host of Match of the Day, his social media activity again in recent weeks. And, there's also sort of been issues around whether there's been political interference at the BBC. I think the appointment of Samir Shah, you'll know better than I do, quite an interesting appointment.
Well, Samir Shah's not a grand city figure in the tradition of some of the other recent appointments. Samir Shah's actually a serious broadcaster. When I first came down to work at BBC Westminster, he was the head of the Westminster operation. He's a serious political producer of very long standing, was on Panorama and various other programmes for quite a while. So it'd be very interesting to see what he does when he's in charge of the BBC. But I am interested in this absolute fetishisation of Gary Lineker. Why on earth it is grown politicians are completely obsessed by what's tweeted by a football commentator. If I tweeted some of the stuff Gary Lineker tweeted, I would be in trouble, but then I was doing political programmes. I was directly involved as a political correspondent. He isn't. And I just do wonder if this is all getting slightly out of proportion because Gary Lineker's a Remainer and has become a bit of a hate figure in certain sections.
He's also, I mean, he's got huge political podcasts in his
Pod power.
Yes, pod power, and he's got huge social media following. He can reach many more people than most politicians can, and that's why one of the reasons it bothers them.
But I'm sure he'd continue doing it whether he's working for the BBC or not, for a start. Also on the committee corridor, incidentally, and just worth marking, another duffing up for the Permanent Secretary, the top official at the Home Office, Sir Matthew Rycroft, at the Home Affairs Select Committee, who still aren't at all happy about some of his performances. They were quizzing him about the cost of the Rwanda scheme, and it wasn't a happy sight.
They raised questions about the integrity, the accountability, the objectivity and the transparency of his approach to informing them as committee chairs about the Rwanda Bill costs and this whole deal and what it involves.
Yes, and it all concluded with the chair of the committee, Dame Diana Johnson, saying that there was not a good relationship between the committee and the department, and if he thought it was, he was delusional. So that was a pretty sharp way to end the occasion. And just another thought, there's a regular stream at the moment of quite senior MPs announcing their departure from Parliament. It's with an election looming, there's quite a lot of pressure on people to say will they stay or will they go, or will they at least attempt to stay. But the latest name to come up in that connection is the former Labour Chief Whip Nick Brown, who's had the whip withdrawn and has been the subject of an internal Labour investigation for really quite a long time now, well over a year, on allegations that we simply don't know about. And there's a very interesting natural justice question here, that his career in Parliament has basically been ended. He's decided to quit Parliament and indeed the Labour Party over the handling of his case. He'll be leaving at the next election, and nobody actually knows what caused it. The nature of the allegations against him have never been made public, and you do have to feel that this is a pretty uncomfortable way for a former Chief Whip to leave Parliament, especially when, in the normal run of things, former Chief Whips can expect to be translated to the House of Lords and don the ermine and take a role there. But I suspect that's not going to happen in this case.
No. We've talked on a previous episode about this whole question of standards and investigation of MPs who are accused of things. On the one hand, there's the parliamentary system, but there's also the party system, and this is where the problems here arise, that it seems to be a party inquiry, and nothing, as far as I can tell, has leaked out. I mean, you often sort of hear on the jungle drums at Westminster of,
X is accused of Y.
Yeah, and nothing is being picked up. So, yeah, and he's clearly decided, he's been in Parliament for many years, but he's clearly decided he's had enough and he's off.
So we'll have to wait for his memoirs, and if Nick Brown does write his memoirs, I imagine they'll be pretty interesting.
Indeed. Oh, one thing I wanted to flag, Mark, is we've not covered international legislatures much on the pod so far, but there's some really interesting events in Poland. So, following the recent general election, there's been a sort of a resurgence of interest in democracy, particularly amongst young people. But you're starting to see that in the number of people who are watching the parliamentary proceedings of the Polish Parliament, the Sjem. And, they're getting 100,000, 200,000 people watching it every day, live proceedings. They've got 4 million views of this week's proceedings on Monday on YouTube. It's sort of started to be called, because the Sjem, they're starting to call it Sjemflix. And what was really striking was the Deputy Speaker of the Polish Parliament. Now, I apologise to any Polish listeners for my accent here. Krzysztof Bosak, the Deputy Speaker, he actually answered a question from a viewer on YouTube via YouTube chat whilst he was in the chamber chairing proceedings. Now that's public engagement for you.
Well, that's what you call interactivity. When I was back in the BBC 1,000 years ago, one of the things that was very striking about the viewing figures for BBC Parliament was that they ticked up very sharply in the build-up to the Iraq War, subsided a bit but never subsided to their previous levels, and then zoomed skywards when, amongst other things, we too were doing commentary on the live events of the great Brexit controversies. There are moments when attention is drawn to a parliament, and sometimes when people start watching it, they find the process interesting enough to keep on watching, even when it's not flaming controversy.
Yep.
Now to next week's events in Parliament, of which there don't seem to be all that many, because there's 2 sitting days before honourable members and noble lords break for Christmas, and it looks like a pretty humdrum agenda for the most part.
It is. I mean, certainly in terms of legislative business and debates. I mean, one thing to look out for is the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is up in front of the Liaison Committee, which is the body of chairs of select committees. They're going to be questioning him. They've sort of grouped the questions into global affairs, economic issues, COP28 and energy concerns.
Well, the COP28 section should certainly be interesting. But these sessions that started with Tony Blair way back in the day, so they've been going for nearly 10 years now, these sessions have very seldom really delivered. There's always the expectation that one day there's going to be a gotcha moment where a sort of beaten Prime Minister, bruised and battered, sort of sits back in his chair and says, it's a fair cop, society's to blame, I'm going to resign immediately. That's never happened. Most Prime Ministers, I think, are pretty capable of fighting their corner in the kind of inquisition that they get at the Liaison Committee. And the Liaison Committee members themselves say, but stop looking for a gotcha moment. This is about scrutiny. It's not intended as a sort of melodrama.
Yeah.
But there have, of course, been some remarkable occasions. I mean, the surreal session when Boris Johnson, on pretty much the last day of his premiership, was answering questions about his policy when the dogs in the street knew that he was going to be out in a matter of hours. That was a very, very strange session. So just occasionally there's something there. And maybe one day there will be a day when a Prime Minister is absolutely in the eye of a storm and his back's to the wall, to mix my metaphors furiously. And those sessions will be really, really high drama. But it hasn't really happened yet.
No, one of the issues is, I think, the structure, because you've got, there's a lot of select committees, the chairs all want their say, they all want their opportunity. So they don't focus on one particular angle, and once they've sort of, got him on the ropes, it's then okay, they're switching to the next person in the queue for answering questions. Yeah. Whereas having just maybe one or two members asking the questions would allow to keep the pressure on him.
They have actually managed to sharpen up the sessions quite a bit by deciding a bit more rigorously on the subjects, to be honest.
Still quite a lot of them asking.
I'm still traumatised by the time when Tony Blair was in front of the committee and each of the select committee members, and this was all select committees at that stage, not a selection of them, got the chance to ask a question. And so you had some rigorous political controversy, and then it was the turn of a Tory MP called David Tredinnick, who chaired the catering select committee, who was known to be a complete obsessive about homeopathic medicine, and Tony Blair was suddenly fielding questions about homeopathy with that wonderful sort of slightly quizzical corner of the lip curl that he would do on occasions when he thought that the questions were actually a bit off-piste. That kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. They're much more rigorous about it these days. But even so, as you say, sometimes the Buggins turn system of questioning means that just when you think you're getting somewhere, it's time for someone else to have their moment.
And just very briefly before we finish, there's the recall petition in Peter Bone's constituency of Wellingborough. The result will be out next week.
With the general expectation of a by-election to follow in that seat. Now, that was a Tony Blair landslide high watermark gain in 1997, if people remember, an MP called Paul Stinchcombe, who became one of the law officers who sat for Wellingborough until Peter Bone won in, I think, 2005. But, of course, there's now the potential for another recall process because the Conservative MP, Scott Benton, has been given a swinging sentence or at least has had it recommended by the Common Standards Committee. So we could well see another by-election to follow in Blackpool South if, again, there's a petition of his constituents and a recall is voted for there.
Yeah, so watch this space. Well, that's all from us for this week's episode of Parliament Matters. Please hit the follow or subscribe button in your podcast app to get the next episode as soon as it lands.
And help us to make the podcast better by leaving a rating or review on Apple or Spotify and sharing your feedback. Our producer tells us it's important for the algorithm to give the show a boost.
And Mark, tell us more about the algorithm.
What do I know about algorithms? I write my scripts with a quill pen on vellum and then send it in by carrier pigeon.
Well, before we go, a quick reminder also that you can send us your questions on all things Parliament by visiting hansardsociety.org.uk/PMUQ.
We'll be discussing them in future episodes, including our special Urgent Questions editions dedicated to what you want to know about Parliament.
And you can find us across social media at Hansard Society to get more content related to the show and the wider work of the Hansard Society.
Parliament Matters is produced by the Hansard Society and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. For more information, visit hansardsociety.org.uk/PM or find us on social media at Hansard Society.